Dr. Neil Matson is a professor in the School of Integrative Plant Science in the horticulture section at Cornell University. And his research program is looking to understand how environmental factors and cultural practices affect greenhouse crops. So today, Neil is going to provide some timely information for us about winter lighting for houseplants. So thanks for being here today, Neil, and you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Matt. We're going to kick off with a question. So, how many of you, put in chat, if you will, what is your favorite house plant and does it thrive in wintertime? So take a moment and put that into chat and we'll take a look at a few of the responses. And while you're chatting, I'll note that I kind of have two favorites. One is a Phalaenopsis orchid that's in my bay window that does not really thrive in winter, but it doesn't die. And then I have a lemon tree, a little dwarf lemon tree in a container that I love. It also does not thrive in winter time, but it survives. And then I put it outside in the summertime. So, but there's more I can do. Ooh, great. We're seeing lots of really nice responses. Banana tree, ponytail palm, jade plants, anthurium, Christmas cactus, yay. Poinsettia with struggles inside until it can go out again. Brugmansia, polka dot plant, Schefflera, jade, Queen's tears. Christmas cactus, orchids. Oh my gosh, lovely. I'm excited. I just want to go out and buy a bunch of plants at this point and then try to not kill them for a little while. So thank you everyone for the responses. And we'll hopefully get at why our indoor plants have a hard time thriving in the wintertime and some of the things that we can do with where we put them in our house and selecting plants for different locations in our house and then even adding supplemental light if we want to do that. So I wanted to start off with a little bit about growing plants outdoors versus indoors, and there's quite a bit of difference in those environments. So typically outdoors, at least under full sun or partial sun, has lots of light, much higher light than we would ever have indoors inside of a home. With the possible exception of like a bay window or a south-facing window. Outdoors, we can have fairly high humidity, at least in the summer time of the year, and really wide temperature extremes within a day or from day to day. Um, and in general, those outdoor conditions, at least the high light, for example, is really favorable for plant growth, which means that we need to provide a lot of fertilizer and light and water while our plants are growing quickly. And then in the indoor environment, we have much lower light. We'll talk about some of those in more detail. We tend to have quite a bit lower humidity. At least if you air condition a house in the summertime and you heat a house in the wintertime, we have quite low humidity. And we can think about what that does for our plants. And relatively constant temperature. You might set your thermostat on a day temperature and a night temperature and maybe have a 10-degree difference in temperature. But compared to outdoors where there could be a 30-degree or 50-degree difference in temperature sometimes, it's relatively constant. And because of these relatively low light levels, a lot of times our plants are not growing much or very quickly at all indoors. And so we would call those conditions favorable for plant maintenance. And that means the plant isn't really adding additional biomass or weight or size, but it's maintaining its current size. And sometimes if we do get new leaves to grow, that might be at the expense of old leaves if we don't have enough light. Like the plant will have to scavenge the energy from the old leaves to feed the growth of new leaves. So under those kind of plant maintenance conditions, because the plant's not gaining a lot of weight or biomass over time, we also do not need to fertilize very much under those conditions. And then these indoor conditions are even more extreme during the winter time than they are during the summertime. So the amount of natural sunlight that we get outdoors in the wintertime is about a quarter of what we get in the summertime because days are shorter, and at least in upstate New York, we get a lot of cloud cover in the wintertime. So why is light important for plants? It goes back to photosynthesis, which is how plants get the energy they need to grow. And we all probably remember from our high school biology classes, photosynthesis is where light is the driving energy force for taking in, the plant takes in carbon dioxide from the air and water from its roots, and then it turns that into sugars. The way that plants are, how much photosynthesis plants can produce, is one of the big factors driving their growth rate. And we could think about, so this is a bit scientific, but the horizontal axis shows us light intensity, and full sun in summertime, the highest amount of light that we would get is about 2,000 micromoles per meter squared per second. Or I'm going to talk about foot candles in a minute here. That's about 10,000 foot candles. And a plant grown in the sun has kind of the photosynthetic machinery. It has thicker leaves and it's adapted to growing under higher light conditions. So plants growing under full sun have higher rates of photosynthesis. They can kind of take advantage of those higher light levels. However, on the low end of the light spectrum, there's some point where the light levels are so low, we call this the light compensation point, where below this, they're not making net energy. Because besides photosynthesis, plants are also respiring, which means they're using their sugar reserves or their carbohydrate reserves and burning through those to maintain themselves. So at some lower light level, then we have light, but it's not enough for the plant to have positive photosynthesis or a net growth at that point. And then if we compare that to a plant growing in the shade, they've acclimated to those lower light levels. So what we tend to have are wider, thinner leaves to try to capture more light that will hit a broader surface area. But then per individual unit area, that leaf does not have as much of that photosynthetic machinery. So our maximum rate of photosynthesis is lower. But then our plants also have a lower light compensation point, so they can still survive or maintain themselves at lower light intensities. So let's talk a little bit more about units of light. For humans, we typically talk about light in terms of foot candles or lumens. And a foot candle, I liked these. I saw these, I think it was on Etsy that I grabbed this photo from. Someone made these candles shaped like foot. So that could be a foot candle. But what a foot candle is it was a standard amount of light produced by one candle, and then what a lumen is, so if you buy light bulbs at the hardware store, they will tell you how many lumens they are. And a foot candle is 1 lumen of light that's on a square foot surface area. So we'll be talking more about how many foot candles of light we get in different parts of our house by different windows and things like that. And then for plants, as a plant scientist, we typically use this unit that's called photosynthetic photon flux density. So it's all of the light that's visible from purple all the way to red, so 400 to 700 nanometers. And then we use a different unit that's a little bit more complicated. So micromoles is a really large number, so it's how many particles of light hit a square meter per second. And then at least for sunlight, there's kind of a conversion factor where we can multiply that ppfd times 5 to give us foot candles. So if we're in kind of a fairly low light situation, we might have 100 micromoles per meter squared per second of light. That would give us about 500 foot candles. Okay, so keep that frame of thought. So how much light is there? So outdoors, the maximum amount of light that we can get is 10,000 foot candles. That'd be like on a sunny day in June with no cloud cover. In the shade on that same sunny day, the leaves that are making it shady are going to filter 90% of that light. So we'll get about 1,000 foot candles. And then if it's a cloudy winter day, we get about 250 foot candles of light. So now let's think about how much light we have inside of our home. So we get the most direct sunlight in a south-facing window. And so we can get up to 500 foot candles of light there. If we're in an office location with maybe a light, a desktop lamp and a window and my overhead lights on, I'm getting about 100-foot candles. And then if it's nighttime and I have a table lamp on, it's maybe only 20-foot candles. So one of the things that's pretty neat is for humans, we're able to see under very low light levels compared to what full sun is. But plants need somewhat closer to full sun to do really well for photosynthesis. So plants need a lot more light than humans do to carry out their business. So a thought question is think about where is the sunniest spot in your house. And what I usually do to think about this is I think about where my cat, actually I have 3 cats. Where do the cats like to congregate in the wintertime? So they'll go to those south-facing windows and find where they're directly shining in, and they spend hours and hours there. So that would probably be the highest light spot in your house and the best place to put at least plants that need higher light levels. So if we think about the window directions in our house, the south facing window is going to have the most intense light. There can be a little heat buildup, at least directly by that window. So we would want to usually set our house plants back at least 6 inches so they don't have that direct intense heat buildup. And then the east and west windows in our house are going to have only about 2/3 of the light of a south facing window. And then north facing is only going to give us about 1/5 of the light of a south window. Some other factors we need to think about is how far away are plants from the window. The farther away you are, light drops off very quickly. Is there shading from other plants? Are there other outside obstructions as well, like trees, shrubs, buildings, and awnings? So if our plants are growing with too little light, some of the things we should be aware of is that their growth is going to be leggy or spindly. And like from the example of this money plant here, there's a pretty long distance between each leaf. Each leaf also has a very long extended petiole. Um, and that plant may also be growing only in one direction. It might be leaning toward the light. This then could be bad for the shape of the plant. Instead of having a uniform compact plant, this plant may be more sensitive to stresses. And it could also have poor growth. So we'll have that maintenance growth instead of like true growth, where any growth is at the expense of old leaves dying and giving their energy to the plant. We'll also have reduced flowering as well. And so if we had plants growing under higher light, they're going to be more resistant to stresses. They have more energy they're kind of healthy, so they're able to overcome pest and disease issues more quickly. And we should think about if our plants are growing under lower light, water uptake and nutrient uptake are much lower than under high light. So we would not need to water them as frequently. We would also not need to fertilize them very often as well. Lower temperatures can also help a plant survive lower light, and that relates to that respiration side of the equation. So respiration is plants burning through their energy reserves, and if our plant doesn't have enough light to photosynthesize very well, if we keep the plant under lower temperatures, then the plant can survive longer because we reduced the respiration rate. So it doesn't burn through as many reserves. And an example of that is my basement is usually about 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the wintertime. That's where I put my citrus tree in the wintertime. So it's in a south-facing window in my basement under cool temperatures. And that seems to help it survive longer than keeping it upstairs in my house where it's 70 degrees Fahrenheit and pretty low light in the bay window on the south side of my house. So let's now look at some groupings of plants. There's a large category of plants that are low light plants. These tend to be plants that have adapted to growing in the shade or growing in the understory of other plants. For these plants, we want a minimum of 25-foot candles of light for several hours per day. So that could be in a north window. It could be far away, like 10 feet away from a south window. And some of these are foliage plants like philodendron and snake plant and pothos and ZZ plant. We'll share these slides afterwards, and we'll also share a longer list from the University of Florida that I really like as well. So you don't have to necessarily scribble these down really quickly. Then we have our group of houseplants that are medium light plants. They need about 75 to 100 foot candles of light for maintenance, and about 200 foot candles of light for growth. So those would be about 4 to 10 feet from our east or west windows. They would be about 10 feet from our south window or an unobstructed north window. So things like African violet, Boston fern, monstera, rubber plant, spider plant, these are our medium light plants. Then we have our highlight plants. These need a minimum of 200 foot candles for maintenance and at least 500 foot candles for growth. So these should be close, less than 4 feet from a southeast or west window. We want bright, direct sunlight for several hours per day. And so hibiscus, jade plant, phalaenopsis are all examples that fit into there. And finally, we have our very highlight plants. So these will have need a minimum of 1,000 foot candles of light for several hours a day. This is very difficult to achieve indoors. So maybe a bay window that's south facing can get up there, or a sunroom. Otherwise, you might need to use supplemental light or a light shelf. So cactus and succulents, citrus, gardenia, hibiscus, geraniums that I want to grow. Vegetable starts would be another one that fits into that category. And a question that often comes up is how much light do you have? Um, Besides, you can buy a light meter for about $300 that measures this very well, but in lieu of spending $300 on it, you can do the paper test. So this is where you hold up a white piece of paper near the location that you're interested in. Place your hands about 12 inches between that paper and the light source, and then look at the shadow of your hand on that piece of paper. So if it's highlight conditions, you're going to see a distinct shadow. If it's medium light conditions, you're going to see kind of a shadow with fuzzy edges. And then if it's low light conditions, you're going to barely see any shadow. And I think the last slide that I will have here is a lot of people will build light shelves, especially for starting vegetable transplants, but you could also use these for growing your higher light plants in the wintertime as well. So people will use typically fluorescent or LED grow lights. These are typically the long ones that might be up to 4 feet wide, for example. Incandescent lights don't give us, luckily, we don't buy many incandescent light bulbs anymore, but they give us a lot of waste heat and not so much light. So we typically avoid incandescent lights. And then the amount of light, we usually target about 10 watts of light per square foot of bench space. So if I had a 2 foot by 4 foot bench, that would be 8 square feet. So I'd want the total wattage of the bulbs that I'm using to be 80 watts at least. And then the closer you can move those lights to your plants, the easier it's going to, or that's going to allow more light to get to the plants. So try to move the light to within just a few inches above the plants if possible. But don't have the leaves growing up into the light because that can burn them from the bulbs. All right, let me stop there, and we can see if any questions came in on chat.
Great. Well, thanks, Neil. Tons of information there, a lot to consider for everybody listening in today, things that I hadn't even thought about, including the distance from the window and how that's going to affect light. So I think our viewers are going to take away a lot of information today. We had one comment which you ended up addressing. Attendee said, this illustrates why windowsills are poor for seed germination in winter and early spring. So you mentioned that is a very high light environment that's needed to germinate those seeds.
Yes, right. Great comment. Yeah, so there's just not, maybe in a bay window, in a south-facing window, it'll be okay. My grandma used to start all the vegetable transplants for my family while both of my parents were working, which was really lovely for her. And one of the things she did when it got later in the spring was she would take them outside every day and set them on the porch. So if it's like a warm April day, she'd bring them outside, they can get their sunlight, and then she'd have to bring them back at night. This was in northern Minnesota, so we wanted to make sure they didn't freeze. So you could do a more labor intensive thing like that. Otherwise, I think light shelves are the way to go.
Great.
And a comment did come in that I can clarify. So I think my slide said it wrong. Plants under low light are going to be less resistant to those stresses. So they're not going to have a lot of energy. And the analogy we could think about is if we as humans aren't getting our 8 hours of sleep a day that we're supposed to get and eating healthy, if we're running ragged, then we're more likely to succumb to sickness. So same thing. If our plants are getting sufficient light, they're going to be more resistant to stresses.
So another question that came in was, what's worse, using supplemental lighting sporadically or not using it at all?
Ooh, so plants are pretty good at growing under variable light conditions because in nature, one day could be cloudy and one day could be sunny. And if the plant's growing in partial shade, 1 second they might be shaded, the next second they're not. So all that to say, like if you can periodically give plants supplemental light, that will help them. And then so go ahead and add that supplemental light when you can. Maybe the one caveat I would say is if you go from a plant growing under very low light conditions and you move it outside under like full sun to very high light conditions, that can damage the plant. That can cause sun scald, so kind of like sunburn of the plant. And so that was because the plant has adapted to very low light conditions indoors, and you suddenly expose it to full light, that can burn those cells of the plant and get that sunburn. So when I'm moving my lemon tree outdoors in the summertime, what I shouldn't do is move it directly from my basement to full sun. What I want to do is for acclimate it for a couple weeks. So move it to partial shade or shade outside. And then every few days I can move it to progressively a little bit more light until I get it in the full sun.
Great. We'll do one more question. There were several more that came into the chat, so we'll follow up with you about those. But the next question that came in was, do I need to buy light bulbs specifically for plants if you're making a plant shelf, or is it just a specific type of light that will work?
Yeah, mostly you don't have to buy a specific grow light. So any type of fluorescent or LED light that's used for human lighting, those are broad spectrum light that are pretty good. I would say only for like commercial greenhouse growers or indoor growers, if they want to squeeze every like an additional like 10% yield out of the plant or something, then they might adjust the spectrum of their light and use a grow light. So it can't hurt in your home setting, but there's no need to buy a grow light specifically.
Terrific. Well, thank you again, Neil. Again, there's some more questions that we'll follow up with Neil to get answered in the YouTube video. But we want to thank you for a great presentation today. At this time, we're going to transition over to our IPM Minute. And for our January, we tend to do a recap of the previous year. So you can stick around and watch the video. I'll also put the link to that video in the chat if you'd like to watch it directly.
It's the Goldilocks rule here. You want to get it just right. You don't want to be in the first image on the left. You don't want to be too close to the bud because you might either nick the bud or the bud may dry out. The image on the far right is just right. It's angled away from the bud. There's a tiny bit of a stub, but not a long stub. And that's what you're looking for.
There's a prohibited list, plants that cannot or should not be sold because of their invasive species component. And then also there's a regulated list, plants that are invasive species, but in certain situations can be sold and used.
What is a native plant? It's one that grows in the same habitat it originated in. And plants can be native to continent, states, or regions.
If you do have these products, the first thing is don't use them, okay? Not just because it's illegal to do it. The reason is the risk to pollinators is too high.
if we're able to delay our plantings until June 1st, most of the common ragweed, and if not all of the common ragweed, will already have emerged. So if you can come through and rototill or prepare your garden for planting after that, you'll basically won't have any common ragweed in most of New York.
Now start with pre-baiting, which means we're going to give them the food without setting the trap.
It was mowed at 3.5 inches, and the dandelions are doing just great. They're able to survive that mowing. When it was taken down to 3 inches, we still have quite a bit of dandelions that are able to survive that. And it wasn't until 2-inch height of cut that we reduced the flowering from the dandelions in those plots.
Truth is, clippings do not contribute to thatch. Thatch happens to be a dense layer of stems and other material that lay on top of the soil and are formed because of an imbalance of fertility, of acidity, and also compaction, and the lack of microorganisms to break down that thatch that would normally be there.
And then things like these corrugated downspouts can actually lead to a lot of mosquito breeding inside the ridges. Because after all the water comes down your downspout, those ridges hold water after the fact, and it will allow mosquitoes to effectively breed in there.
These are eggs laid by the winsome fly, and they've actually released it to try and get control of the adults. It kills the adults in about 6 to 7 days, which is pretty fast for biological control. So if you see a Japanese beetle with these little white eggs on it, you might want to leave it because then the next generation will hatch out, and so it'll increase the population in your area.
The box tree moth is a relatively recent invasive species in New York State, and it's one that is largely, almost exclusively, a pest of ornamental boxwoods.
Bedbugs aren't everywhere, but they can be anywhere, and people inadvertently pick them up, bring them home, and they may not know they have them for a period of time.
I'm going to answer this question right off the bat here in a few seconds. You found a bug at home, now what? Answer is relax. You know, it's all good. You have to figure out what it is to see if you do have to worry about it.
Our main takeaways here from these 4 years of data is really that the Asian longhorn tick and the Lone Star tick are definitely present in the southern portions of our state, but we didn't collect any samples of either of these ticks in the western or northern regions of New York State.
Providing large feeders, different seed combinations to bring in a variety and a diversity of birds into your garden, offering some fatty food in the winter.
The next thing, which goes along perfectly with the previous talk, is to put it outside for bird shelter. Put it close to your bird feeder. You can also add bird food on it.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for sticking around. If any of those presentations piqued your interest, you can go back and watch videos from our 2024 season. And we hope to see you on a future First Friday event. So thank you again to Neil for his presentation today, and we hope you have a great weekend. Take care.